See a lot of familiar faces in the room today. This is really nice. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies, and we're joined today by Stephanie Baker, a veteran Bloomberg reporter, investigative reporter, who's been at Bloomberg, I think, like since 1998. Correct?
Forever, yes.
Okay. And Stephanie, who's based in the UK, is here today to talk about her new book, which just came out, Punishing Putin: Inside the West's Economic War to Bring Down Russia, or Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. So it's a fantastic book. I think I see some people in the room today who know a lot about this book because they feature in it. We'll have plenty of time during this conversation for some back and forth. And so people have in the room a QR code that you can scan to submit questions, and those will get fed up to me here. And then there's also a YouTube feed, which hopefully people are watching right now. And those folks who are tuned in on YouTube can also submit questions. So we'll leave plenty of time for that. So please start thinking about things to bring up with Stephanie. So let's start by rolling the camera back to November of, I believe it was 1996, when you landed in Moscow, and you went for a somewhat fateful walk in a Moscow park. And I'm sort of curious about what happened to you in that park and what kind of broader view or sort of glimpse into Russia's transition that gave you. Because I want to sort of draw the linkage from some of those bad old days to the current bad days.
Actually, I landed for the first time in Moscow, I think, in more like, we moved there in May of 1996. So I was still just getting my feet on the ground. But at that point, I was working for Radio Liberty in their Moscow office, and I would walk home, and was walking home through this small little garden park and stumbled across a contract killing, which, needless to say, freaked me out. There was a guy lying down in a sort of light dusting of snow, bleeding out, and I had these, Russian police officers shooing me away, and I sort of scurried home, freaked out, and then watched on the news that evening that it was just one of the many kind of mafia killings that had been plaguing, Russia, Moscow in particular, during that period. That was a very chaotic period, and actually, when I was writing the book, I realized that I couldn't tell the story, for one, about the sanctions against the oligarchs, or two, about the rise of Putin without covering that period. And so I had to reflect on my time there, and I had went back through some of the clips I had written and some of the travels that I had, trips that I'd taken, including, to Siberia, covering, coal miner strikes and the sort of crisis there. And it just was such it really made me put it in a different perspective, going back and rethinking that period and how the sort of economic chaos of that time did, in fact, lead to the rise of Putin.
So let's talk about the title of the book. And again, let me just stipulate up front, it's a fantastic book, and it's very much a glimpse behind the curtain of especially Western policymaker calculus and decision-making and the sort of pressure of the moment, both in the run-up to the war and then the period since February 22nd, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. So it's very much kind of like, for a policy person perspective, it's a really enlightening look at the way the United States and our European partners conceptualized the sanctions program and then iterated throughout this very chaotic past nearly 3-year period. But I want to come to the title of the book, where you talk about bringing down Russia. And I'm sort of curious, what do you think the sanctions were conceived to do? And were they to bring down the Putin regime, to hamper the Russian war machine, to turn Russia into a global pariah so that there couldn't be any reversion to business as usual after what was widely expected to be a kind of successful Russian military onslaught?
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised the subtitle, because I did have a debate with my publisher about, is that really the subtitle? Can't we change it to let's bring down the Russian regime, or make it a bit more targeted? In the end, we went with this broader subtitle, which I did make an effort in the book, I think, to try to distinguish between the Russian people and the Russian regime. The object of sanctions, I think it changed over the course of the war. Obviously, the sanctions are, in theory, about behavior change, but I think it became clear very quickly that it was going to be very hard to influence Putin's behavior, and that sanctions, as a way of slowing him down and undermining the war machine, was probably a more effective target and goal. And I think that's how policy shifted. And I think there were some overly optimistic predictions early on that the unprecedented actions that they took within the first month or two, in particular the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves, this $300 billion pot of money, that those actions would have, bring Russia to its knees. And in fact, in the first month, of course, you saw the Russian economy sway and the ruble weaken considerably, and then it rebounded. And it rebounded on the back of Russian oil revenues. And I think that ended up posing the greatest challenge for the sanctions coalition, that ironically, Russia was profiting from the very war it had started, that oil prices shot up because of concerns about global supply and everyone backing off from touching Russian oil. Oil prices shot up to record levels, and they suddenly had this dilemma on their hands. He was using these record oil revenues to finance the war and to stabilize the economy, and so they had to figure out a way to try to limit those revenues. And I think that has been the main thing that has bedeviled this whole project from the beginning.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I really want to go through it somewhat systematically. And I'm reminded by the presence here of a very prominent former practitioner who used to be the U.S. Lead sanctions cook in the Devil's Workshop, Ambassador Dan Freed, who's sitting here with us.
Who I spoke to for the book, and he's making me very nervous by his presence that I might say something quite slightly off.
That's one of Dan's stock and trade tactics, I should say. But the thing that Dan, I'll let him speak for himself later perhaps, is always said is that sanctions are a tool, and they're not an end in themselves, and they can't be a policy in and of themselves. And I'm just curious, can you walk us through, you had a lot of access in the reporting for this book to people who thought that they would be able to design an unprecedented, broad-ranging sanctions program against an economy of Russia's size that was globally significant, and that it would do something. It would, cause this regime to feel the rug was pulled out of it as Russia was unplugged from global payment systems. It would disrupt all sorts of the internal plumbing of the Russian economy, that it would disrupt how people functioned and received their paychecks, or what the prices were that they paid at the till. There was a very sort of ambitious, sweeping set of goals at the earliest stages. And I'm just sort of curious, when you think about what you learned during the reporting, and then you stack it up against where we are today, where the Russian economy has proven, as you were describing, to benefit from a lot of structural factors, like the fact that Russia earns tens of billions of dollars a month from its exports of hydrocarbons. I'm just curious, can you just drill back down into what you think was in the minds of Western policymakers that they were going to do in this horrific moment to Russia that was well-deserved? But I'm just curious, if you had to really drill down, what do you think in the minds of people in the White House, in the UK, and especially in Berlin, they thought they were going to achieve?
One of the things that struck me as I was reporting this book was that because the actions were so unprecedented, that it actually amounted to a grand experiment, that they didn't actually know how some of these actions would play out. In particular, the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves is $300 billion. How would that affect global markets? They didn't know because it had never been done before. Same with the attempts to try to limit the price, Russia's revenues from oil by putting a price cap on Russian oil. denying Western services and insurance to Russian oil unless it was traded and sold under $60 a barrel. That a lot of it was just so experimental that they didn't know how it was going to pan out over time. I think that there was too much optimism early on that these were such extreme measures that it would really slow Putin down. And I think there was an underestimation, for instance, that India would turn out to be such a major buyer of Russian oil. It went from importing something like 1% of its oil from Russia to 40%. Now, that was on one level, part of the design. That Washington, London, and Brussels wanted to keep oil flowing in order to not have a huge price spike, so that it would cause pain for consumers at home. But I think that was unexpected. That no one thought that India would end up, opportunistically entering the market and scooping up Russian oil in that way. And then you saw things, further evolve that, Indian refineries were then taking Russian oil, refining it, and then shipping it back to Europe. So I do think that the experimental nature of what was done was a lot of tinkering and evolution as things went on. And especially if you've got a coalition as large as the Sanctions coalition is, stretching across so many countries, the EU and all the member states with their different agendas and different economic interests, the UK, the US, and Japan, that there was a lot of back and forth as to how policy was going to land. And there wasn't necessarily a certainty of where things would end up. And there were various carve-outs by countries like Hungary, what have you, on energy supplies that skewed things. So I do think that the hopes were perhaps too grand that this would deliver the knockout blow. Mm-hmm. And then they had to go back to the drawing board and kind of come up with other measures to try to undermine Russia's revenues and his ability to fund the war.
So I don't recall when I read the book that there's a Cassandra figure who runs around saying, I'm not sure this is going to work. There wasn't a sort of voice inside Western governments that was expressing the skepticism about where we ended up. Does that align with your reporting?
I don't think there was one who was just sort of saying this is not going to work. But again, I would stress that there were different definitions of what "quote unquote" working means. I think the definition of working quickly evolved from, okay, we're not going to be able to use sanctions to push Putin out of Ukraine, but can we use sanctions to impose meaningful costs on the Russian economy that will create friction and make it harder for him to sustain the war long term? And I think that quickly shifted to become the goal when there was a clear realization that there was not going to be regime change. I mean, that was never. I don't think the sanctions policy was ever explicitly about regime change, but that it was going to be very hard to persuade just through economic pressure alone or through pressure from the elites for a turn, for Putin to withdraw his troops.
So help me out here for a second, and I probably am going to oversimplify things, but oftentimes it felt, looking at the book and also just the events that you're chronicling, that it often fell on the Biden administration to be the realist in the room and to restrain particularly European policymakers from taking steps that could have been very injurious to the global economy. And I'm thinking in particular the decision the Europeans made to ban imports of Russian oil. And at that time seemed like a very pressurized move for good reason, given the exposure of Russian war crimes and atrocities in Bucha and other parts of the outer, the environs of Kyiv. But at some point, the light bulb seems to have gone off pretty clearly in the minds of Biden policymakers that inflation is a global threat. And simply removing volumes of Russian oil from global markets will spike inflation, be a tax on consumers, and prices will go up in any event. And so the Russians will be, their products will find their way into global markets. Can you walk us through that moment? Because I think it's something that's not well appreciated, the extent to which the US was, yelling and screaming at the Europeans not to do what they did.
Yeah, I mean, initially, if you remember, after the full-scale invasion, the Europeans were very reluctant to touch energy at all and wanted to make sure that there were carve-outs for financial institutions to ensure that German industry in particular could continue to make payments for Russian natural gas. But then, as you mentioned, the atrocities in Bucha came to light, and that, I think, turned the situation around completely and made many European leaders think the unthinkable. And as one, it was von der Leyen's head of cabinet explained to me, it was like a ball rolling down the hill and all of a sudden you couldn't stop it. Everyone wanted more sanctions because everyone, just the outrage over this atrocious, the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, that really built up. And that is when the Biden administration really kicked into gear. When the Europeans proposed this embargo on Russian oil, they thought, oh my gosh, this is going to take out a huge chunk of global oil supplies. They didn't know how much Russia would actually withhold, and they were trying to sell them on this alternative. And that's when they came up with the price cap on Russian oil, which I go into the sort of the backstory, the discussions behind the scenes as to how they devised that. And that was what I thought was interesting, is just how policy gets made, the sort of policy sausage in Washington and then internationally, that there was a lot of back and forth. The Biden administration spent a lot of time trying to convince European leaders that this was a better way to go, that this crazy idea that everyone thought was mad, that would never work, was actually better than a full-scale embargo that they were proposing, and better than, say, a tariff, which had also been floated, which is interesting given Trump's talk of widespread tariffs now. But the tariff idea was also shot down by the Europeans. So they came up with this price cap, which initially the Ukrainians were really excited about because they thought, this is the great solution to the problem, because they were, I think, the Ukrainians were hoping that the price cap would be set very low. And of course, as time went on and the negotiations between EU member states dragged on, the main point of tension was, where do you set the cap? And they ended up setting it at $60 a barrel, which left the Ukrainians in Kiev crestfallen as to, this was a great opportunity to try to attack Russia's oil revenues, knowing full well that Russia, for instance, in the 90s, sold oil for much, much less. And they continued pumping. They did not withhold any oil. And I think that was the real turning point. There was such an effort into getting that agreement as to where to set the cap. They were supposed to review it on a regular basis with the idea that it could go up or down depending on market forces. But politically, it became impossible to do that. And as you see, they have not revised the cap. They haven't pushed it down, even though there were opportunities to do so when prices shot up.
So do you think that the issue, you have a line in the book where you quote Winston Churchill, in which you say that the price cap was the worst policy considering all the others.
At least bad option.
Yeah, at least bad option. And I'm just sort of curious, is that your verdict, that this was still ultimately bad policy, or is it bad enforcement and lack of political will, or is it the sort of fact that when you crosswalk Western goals on Ukraine and the need to keep inflation in check and keep the global economy humming, there was just some fundamental incompatibility there dealing with a country which, as you said, is either the second or the third largest producer of oil in the global market?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting idea. And again, it goes into the theme of this was a grand experiment. They didn't know how it was going to play out. And I thought there was so much effort into devising that policy. And then it worked for a few months. And then Russia developed and built its shadow fleet of oil tankers to transport oil outside of Western insurance. at a considerable cost. Let's not, forget that cost Russia money, that created the friction that was, intended. But then they didn't enforce it. And I think it was because of concern, again, of taking supply off the market and worsening inflation. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad policy in and of itself, but we don't really know because they didn't enforce it properly. As it is now, they've sanctioned something like 60 ships. And I think they could certainly go further and sanction more of these ships. They are a danger to the environment. There's no real guarantee of any real insurance standing behind these ships. We don't know if any of the alleged insurance backing them would honor any claims, so that if there were an accident with these old tankers, they ran aground and there was an oil spill, it's unclear who would end up paying for that. So I do think that there could be more aggressive action towards targeting and blacklisting some of those ships, because that has been quite effective. You see blacklisted ships just circling in the waters and not finding a port to dock at. I mean, it's not foolproof. There's some that get through and are continuing to do business, but it would be interesting to see the price cap work with really aggressive enforcement on and blacklisting of the shadow fleet.
One issue that was visible, and this is not a new problem, but I think comes across in what you just said, is that national security goals and priorities and economic statecraft are often handled in silos in Western governments. And so the people who work on Russia policy and the people who manage global financial markets, don't have a ton of common either team members or, even sort of speak the same language. And when I think now, and I mean, this sort of just breaks my heart, it literally breaks my heart. There's a report in the last day or so showing that Russia's expected export earnings from its oil and gas sales in 2024 is going to be on the order of $240 billion. And the overall GDP of Ukraine is $190 billion. So we're looking at a structural problem of keeping Ukraine in this fight and fending off the Russian onslaught with one or both arms tied behind our backs as we watch Russia just kind of, bathe in this cash, sort of like Scrooge McDuck. And there's a fundamental unfairness to that.
Yeah.
And also I think there's a lack of reality about the policy discussion, which is so long as Russia is a current account surplus country that is integral to the global economy and that prints money every week, that it's allowed to sell oil to global markets, which is a fungible both commodity and a fungible benefit to them, we are really trapped. And I'm just sort of curious if you feel that now, it's sort of as you sort of reckon with the fact that this war has gone on for nearly 3 years and Vladimir Putin's not, worrying about making ends meet.
Yeah, I wonder if Russia is going to be able to hit their targets. I mean, you've already seen oil prices fall, and now Russian oil is trading at roughly around the price cap, around $60 a barrel. So I wonder if those forecasts are overly optimistic and if they're going to be able to hit that. Obviously, it depends on a number of factors. Russia is part of OPEC Plus, and it's signed up to production cuts and has to work with the cartel. So it's limited as to how it can maneuver. And there are global forces. If there's a global slowdown and a reduction in overall demand for oil, then that will hit Russia indirectly, right? Because the price of oil will fall. But it is the central challenge dealing with the economic response to Russia and like I said, if they can't figure out a way to make this price cap work and really hinder Russia's oil revenues, how are they ever going to stop his ability to fund the defense industry? The third of Russia's budget is going on the war, both defense spending as well as what he's paying for soldiers to go fight on the front. And that doesn't seem like it's going to slow down. But there are pressures building within the Russian economy. There are forecasts that that the Russian economy will slow towards the end of the year and into next year. Inflation is high. It's 9%. Interest rates are like 18%. There are massive labor shortages, and there's a lack of people who these have to increase the bonuses for people to motivate people to sign up to fight. So it's not all rosy. Even if he is able to earn a lot of money, he doesn't have the manpower to keep this going for as long as I think some people think he can. I think the lack of manpower and long-term Russia's demographic challenges, that is a huge challenge for him.
I just want to remind everybody who's in the room or people who are watching on YouTube, the people in the room, just grab your QR code if you've got questions for Stephanie, and then as well for people watching on YouTube, if you can submit questions and we'll start feeding them in over the course of this conversation. Let's try to lighten the mood a bit, and I'll do my best in that department. There are a couple of really fun passages in the book, and probably the one that I found the most entertaining were your takedowns of the Russian oligarchs. And there's this one particularly funny takedown of Oleg Deripaska, who's always been presented as the sort of top of the league table in the Russian oligarch cohort. And so I'd love for you to talk about the loser indie rock band, the music studio, and the fixer who orders Deripaska's clothes from the mall in the US, and then most importantly, the girlfriend or the mistress, whose last name is actually Bardak, which basically means bordello. It would be the nice way to put it.
I didn't want to make that.
Yeah, you didn't make that joke. I'm going to make that joke. But just, it points out both the lunacy of how Russian oligarchs have gamed Western society and Western financial markets, as well as the challenge of making these people squirm and the amount of time and effort and law enforcement and the policy community that's been required. So can you just, first of all, just spin the yarn about Deripaska and his frivolity, and then some of the comeuppance?
Yeah, so Deripaska is someone I interviewed at length at his house outside Moscow in 2011. He gave me like 4 hours and walked me around his compound. This was obviously before the 2014 annexation, and he was basically trying to dig himself out of a financial crisis. He had, his Rusal aluminum empire had gorged on debt, and then when the financial crisis of 2008 came along, he was struggling. I think Deripaska really saw himself as a global businessman, or wanted to position himself as such, while at the same time playing the game inside Russia. He was neighbors with Medvedev and Putin. And I think when he was targeted by sanctions required by Congress in 2018, which blacklisted him, and because he at that time controlled Rusal, upended the aluminum industry, caused all sorts of, the prices of aluminum to shoot up because it was taking all this aluminum capacity out of the market. He managed to get those sanctions lifted, but from that point, from 2018, the Justice Department had their eyes on him and everything he was doing inside the United States. So even after the US sanctioned him, he was still intent on enjoying the fruits of life in America. And you saw that through what was, I think, very interesting, the way the Justice Department handled it, was they just disclosed loads of material. So you had these indictments with such rich detail that I took bits and pieces of and tried to report out the holes in the narrative, so to speak. And the most fascinating bit was how he had bought this music studio in California.
In Santa Monica. I'm from LA, so let's just...
Yeah, I didn't go to the music studio, but I made a lot of phone calls to the people who ran it. And
it's a famous place.
It was a famous studio, right? Yeah. A lot of famous recording artists, I think.
Crosby, Stills,
and Nash. Yep, I'm trying to remember where I wrote. He bought it as a favor to an indie rock band that he somehow befriended called Ringside, who he invited to come play in Russia, and they were complaining about the US music industry, how hard it was to get a recording contract. And he said, well, why don't you just buy a studio? And he's like, well, we can't do that. And so he just bought them a studio and gave this guy an offer he couldn't refuse. It was part of an overall plan that he had to spend something like $100 million buying various US assets. This was before sanctions hit. But at some point after, I think it was 2021, he decided to unload this music studio and sell it, even though he was sanctioned in the US, which meant that his assets were frozen. And the music studio was worth like $3 million. It was like chump change that he wouldn't, for a billionaire like Deripaska, he would not notice. So why he would take the risk of selling the studio? I tracked down the guy who was managing it. But that was the basis. That was just one of the many sanctions violations that the Justice Department got him on. The second, of course, was that his girlfriend,
Bardakova,
who got pregnant, wanted to have her baby in the United States so she could enjoy the fruits of US citizenship. So he went to elaborate lengths to fly her to the United States to give birth, which she did successfully the first time. And then he tried it all over again because she got pregnant again. And so she flew during the pandemic to have her second child, not knowing that the Justice Department was onto her, and got her and nabbed her at LA airport as soon as she landed. And this sort of farcical scenario where she says that no, the father of her baby was not Oleg Deripaska. It was, I think it was Oleg Deripaska or something like that. She sort of mangled the name.
Yeah.
So, but as a result of that, they froze and are attempting to forfeit all of his US assets, including several mansions in the United States, as well as the music studio and the proceeds, and an art collection.
I always think of these situations as resembling a really bad scene from a Cohen Brothers movie.
Yeah.
And this was by far like the funniest, one, because it's just so nuts.
I was trying to lighten the mood between the oil price cap to try to entertain readers and keep them going.
So you live in the UK, and there's a section, or it's actually it's sort of strings throughout the book. You're talking at various points about the way the UK system has coddled and welcomed ill-gotten gains to be invested or property to be purchased by figures like the cast of Russian oligarchs. And I'm just sort of curious, there are vivid scenes in the book where the welcome mat gets rolled up, and some of the most prominent Russian oligarch types like Mikhail Friedman and Peter Oven find themselves scrambling to fund their housekeeping expenses and things like that. But I'm just curious now, if you had to step back, how much you feel that the UK has become fundamentally unwelcoming, or is the political economy of the UK intertwined with this kind of role as an enabler?
Yeah, I think there's been a real sea change. The title of that chapter is called Freezing Londongrad. And of course, having lived in London, I've reported on the amount of Russian money sloshing through banks and property in the UK for years. It was the favorite haunt of Russian billionaires because it's a quick flight from Moscow and a gateway to Europe. I think it really has driven most of the money out. There are still, and I know for a fact, there's still property owned by sanctioned Russians that they have not cottoned on to. And I think the story is just how the UK went from 0 to 100 on sanctions, overnight, as a result of the 2022 invasion. And they were suddenly presented with this dilemma. They had all these Russian oligarchs who had property in the UK, and they didn't have the capacity within the Foreign Office to really roll out a proper sanctions regime. They had to sort of scramble to hire more people, do the kind of research to figure out who was who. And the biggest dilemma they faced was that one of them, Mikhail Friedman, didn't leave. He stayed. And they wanted him out. And they actually said, our policy should be just to let him leave under his own steam. And instead, he decided to stick it out and fight the sanctions, which led to various comical situations of well, not comical, but they tried to get him on sanctions evasion, and they bungled the raid on his multi-million-pound mansion in North London by not basically, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the search warrant and making some other errors, which just left them with egg on their face. That this was their opportunity. They were trying to go after and show that they were going after Russian money. But I think, unlike the comparatively speaking, well-resourced and experienced FBI, UK authorities did not have the means to really go after him. He eventually won damages, actually, and then left London last year.
So you spent a lot of time talking about this issue in the book, and there's a long profile of people involved in what was called the Klepto capture effort at the Justice Department. I'm just sort of curious, from the standpoint of policy efficacy and impact, can you talk about the impact of these people's facing the pressure campaign that they did? Tycoons of all sizes and shapes, and the amount of resources that it took to make cases against them and to try to make them feel unwelcome. I'm just sort of curious, was the policy goal here that this was going to ring bells back in Moscow, and that these people would go tell Vladimir Putin, stop being a genocidal murderer, or was it just like anybody who's in our society who's part of this regime has now got to be removed, and this is the blunt instrument that we're going to use?
I think on two levels. It was, one, what's the point of sanctions unless you really enforce them? And two, it was a final decision that there was to rid Western financial institutions of Russian illicit money as much as possible, and really finally take that seriously. But obviously, it has not been smooth sailing. The Klepto capture unit has seized something like 700 million in total, probably more than that now. But they're going through court procedures, through a very difficult, complicated process of proving sanctions evasion as a predicate for money laundering, and then trying to move to forfeit those assets. And they've gone after several Russian oligarchs, and it's been very difficult. And the case I lead with was the sort of signature seizure of the Klepto capture unit, which is this super yacht called Amadea, which they seized in Fiji and sailed to San Diego. And it's unknown, I call him a mini-gark, Russian billionaire came out of the woodworks claiming it was actually his yacht, has been fighting them every step of the way to try to get his yacht back.
Can you talk a little bit, because again, it's Cohen Brothers-esque, where you have this yacht that the US government now has to pay upkeep on. You have a guy who's fronting for someone else who claims to own it. And we're struggling to provide weapons to Ukraine to fend off an onslaught. So, I understand why this was done, but I do wonder, as colorful as some of these characters are and as odious as they are, I'd like to see the emphasis on the guns and bullets part of the policy, because that's what's going to actually change Putin's strategic calculus at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. He maintains that he owns it, and he maintains that he is the legal on-paper owner, according to the corporate records. And that is what's proving so hard for them to prove that actually that they're trying to argue that there is this sanctioned Russian billionaire that actually controls it. So the idea was that this would not take that long to forfeit and sell and transfer the proceeds to Ukraine, but has taken much longer than anyone anticipated. I think the bigger pot of money is the Russian central bank reserves, $300 billion that was frozen within the first few days of the invasion. And the US was actually prodding the Europeans. The US took more than a year to come around to agree that there was a legal basis to not just freeze the money, but seize that money and use it for Ukraine. But they faced opposition from Europe and division within the EU over over seizing that amount of money. And so I think that is the more substantial pot of money in terms of sanctions that could be used and leveraged to help Ukraine. The super yacht is small change. I mean, the amount of money they're spending per month on it is not that much in the greater scheme of things. I think the big battle is, what do you do with this $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves? They're trying to leverage the interest payments on that to raise a loan of $50 billion that would go to Ukraine. There's been an agreement on it, but it's taken an awfully long time, and the G7 is supposed to agree on it next month. But $50 billion is not enough. That's, Ukraine has, just in terms of reconstruction alone, the cost is much, much higher. Half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been taken out by Russian missiles. This is going to be a really, really rough winter for Ukrainians without power supplies. I was just in Ukraine in June, and already they're suffering from, I have to go home to cook for my kid because I've only got a half an hour left of electricity. It's really bleak.
Yeah, no, it is incredibly unfair. And I'm seeing questions that are coming in from the audience and people watching on YouTube, so that's great. So I want to leave time for those. One of them concerns the disposition of the frozen assets. And I'm just curious, because it's been a live issue that's, people were trying to force to a head, particularly the Biden administration, which has been trying to drag particularly Japan and Germany over the finish line. But I'm just curious, can you help us understand why, when the house is literally on fire in Ukraine and the West is the main financial backstop for Ukraine's ability to sustain this war, the frozen assets can't be addressed and put in the done, kind of over and done box, and it has to stay a kind of apple of discord between the U.S. and some of our key allies?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Why should Western taxpayers be paying for Ukraine when we have all this Russian money? There's an agreement that Russia is legally required to pay for war reparations. So that money is never going back to Russia unless Russia agrees to pay war reparations. So why not just go ahead? The argument is, why not just go ahead and seize that pot of money? There's the typical coalition, the typical division within the EU, which is Poland and the Baltic states are arguing for going all the way, and Germany and France are the ones opposing. Now, Germany is now facing its own budget constraints, and so maybe that will change their mind. But there was concern about this would violate sovereign immunity. This would encourage Russia to seize European assets in Russia. Well, Russia's already doing that. They're seizing the assets of Western companies. There's more money belonging to Western financial institutions in Russia that Putin could seize if he wanted to, but I think it's unrealistic to think that he might not do that anyway. So I think this is something that, again, a bit like the war has played out. We were very slow to provide military aid. It was, we're not going to give you F-16s, and then they took a year to give them F-16s. Very similar to the way the financial sanctions, the sanctions rolled out, they were quite slow. There's certain sanctions that they've rolled out. I read them and I'm going, why are we only doing this now? Why didn't we do this 2.5 years ago? Certain Russian defense enterprises that are only being sanctioned now. I think eventually they'll probably get there, and there will be some consensus, perhaps a change of government in Germany that will enable it to happen.
And I think there's an interplay with U.S. politics, right, where at some point there's going to need to be another congressional package to support Ukraine, and we've been doing these things in, salami slicing, 8-month, 10-month, 6-month increments. And I think, if suddenly $300 billion shows up in the till, people will feel the less political impetus to do the right thing and support Ukraine. So, all of these things, unfortunately, are intertwined, which is...
And if Trump wins, that could change things as well.
So one of the questions people posed, which I think was also a fascinating part of the book, so I'll let you tell the story, is how Western policymakers got the jump on the Russians to seize the assets in the first place in those early weeks of the war, or early days of the war.
The central bank assets.
Yeah. And how, because it's a story that you tell in great detail in the book.
Yeah, so that came together incredibly quickly, and the only reason it did come together was because of French intelligence reporting that Russia was pulling its assets out of Europe, and they were worried that if they didn't move quickly, it might all disappear very quick, within days. So that's why Russia invades on Thursday, February 24th, 2022, and by Saturday they've already got the agreement. There was opposition from Janet Yellen, who was very worried about the consequences and impact of doing that. She had to be persuaded by Mario Draghi. The two had worked together. Mario Draghi is the European Central Bank president. When she was at the Fed, they knew each other for years. She finally agreed, and they took this decision within days. It had been debated as a possibility before, but no one had really taken it seriously until the invasion ended up being on the upper end of expectations rather than just sort of a push out from the Donbass. They decided to sort of turn to the last page of the sanctions escalation book.
And do you feel that now that it's been done, that this tool is going to make the U.S. jurisdiction less attractive? I have lost, any sense of people opting out of U.S. jurisdiction on account of worry about the sanctity of their dollar reserves. It seems like that was a red herring, but I'm just sort of curious if when you look at other countries that would have reason to worry about running afoul at some point of the United States, I assume other than China.
The interesting thing is after 2014, Putin did, and after 2018 in particular, Putin did start reducing Russia's central bank, the holdings in dollars with the central bank governor, Nabiullina, who's played a very crucial role in keeping the Russian economy. I think her role is underestimated, how crucial she has been to keeping the Russian economy going. It could be much worse without her. She's a well-regarded central banker. Was, yes.
No, what she's doing now is shameful.
She's a very well-regarded. She knows what she's doing.
Yeah.
I think if there's anyone that has contributed to Putin's war effort, she is very high up there.
Yeah.
But I think the reports of the dollar's death are greatly exaggerated. I would argue, and you can see that playing out in Russia now. They're going to great extents to import dollar and euros in cash. There was this other report that Russia had imported something like $30 million worth of $100 bills from the Rwandan Defense Ministry. I mean, no one in Russia wants to keep their money in rupees or Chinese yuan, right? I think the dollar and euro are still very much sought after. I think it's been too much of a focus on, people are going to run away from the U.S. dollar when there really isn't an alternative.
Yeah. So there's a question we got about the parade of oligarchs moving the party to the Middle East. And it's a section of the book where you talk about various Russian businesses and high net worth figures and tycoons re-domiciling themselves in places like Dubai, and the cat and mouse game that's currently being played to pressure Emiratis and others not to be allowing the Russians total free reign to operate in their system. Can you talk a little bit about, on balance, how you feel that's going, and do you feel it's similar kind of barn door horse situation and limited cooperation from the Emiratis, or do you feel like it's more of a success story than is widely assumed?
Yeah, I spent a week in Dubai doing interviews and reporting, and the first year after the invasion, there was a flood of Russian money into Dubai, and there were very few restrictions. I think there's been a parade of U.S. officials that have gone to Dubai to warn them about the consequences of that. That has not gone over very well in some cases. There's been a sort of, chafing of being lectured at. But in the end, my reporting indicated that it was getting much harder for Russians to open bank accounts, buy property, but they have turned to other means. And cryptocurrency is one of the biggest ways of moving money around. It kept coming up again and again and again. And I've spoken to several, high-level Russians operating in Dubai, and that is one of the ways to get around it. tether USDT pegged to the dollar is one of the main ways of the Russians have used to move money into Dubai. But I think they have listened, and I think that the opportunities are much narrower than they were in the first year.
So around the time the sanctions effort was launched, there was a lot of expectation surrounding novel use of export controls. And it's another subject that's in the book in some great detail. And we've all seen the Russian economy create various circumvention approaches to access semiconductors and other things that Russian economy needs, and particularly Russian defense industry needs, as well as China stepping in. Can you talk a little bit again, now that we're at a moment for some reflection, on how much you feel the export controls that were, there was so much anticipation about using them in this case, whether, the global economy is too complicated and the networks for circumvention are too robust?
Yeah, I have a chapter on that, and I've done a lot of subsequent reporting on it. It's the principal strategy. They've imposed these export controls with a coalition of almost 40 countries, bringing it back to an almost Cold War footing. But of course, the economy now is very different, and the role of China in producing semiconductors that Russia needs is enormous. And there's a whole chain of middlemen involved, which has allowed some of the US companies to wash their hands of it and say, it's not our problem. I think they haven't done enough to trace and clean up their supply chain. It's quite obvious. I've spent a lot of time going through Russian customs data. It's all there to be seen and had. I think it was significant when the US warned in December that it would impose secondary sanctions on financial institutions that facilitate the flow of goods to Russia's defense industry. That did spook some Chinese financial institutions. And then they widened it again. The definition of who Chinese banks could deal with, they widened that this summer. And that caused a further spook. And what you're seeing now is there's a shortage of Chinese yuan in Russia. There's a payment, I wouldn't say it's a crisis, but there's some degree of disorder. And you can see it in financial markets. The cost of borrowing yuan has shot up. Because Chinese banks, let's face it, they want to do business with the world. They don't, Russia is roughly the size of Italy. It's not, and in terms of an economy, it's not worth being cut off from the US dollar to do that business. And I think that's where the sanctions could be quite effective at driving a wedge between China and Russia, in particular if they impose sanctions on a major Chinese bank for doing that business, they might scare them away from continuing. It's very hard to see how much that's had an effect because you don't have recent Russian customs data. There's a delay. So it's hard to see what's really going on right now.
Well, look, we always try to end on a hopeful note, and I think that will suffice. It is a fabulous book. I would encourage everybody to start looking through what is essentially the first kind of detailed postmortem about how policy was made on the sanctions program, and then an initial kind of look at what has and hasn't succeeded. I'm really grateful to Stephanie Baker. I'm grateful to so many friends of hers and ours who've been here with us in the room. And there's going to be a reception for those of you who are here with us now. So they'll definitely be signing copies of the book, which I hope everyone will buy multiple copies of. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you, everyone else.
Thank you. Thanks, that was great.
It was really fun.